Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling something pretty big, sacrifice. How different cultures and religions throughout history have approached this really fascinating but also pretty complex concept.
It's something that, people tend to have a lot of preconceived notions about.
Oh, yeah.
We think of it as something ancient or violent,
Yeah.
but it's way more nuanced than that.
Right. It's not just about, animal sacrifices and those dramatic rituals.
Right.
We're going to be looking at all sorts of different angles.
Yeah. The meanings are really complex.
So we've got a lot of different sources for this deep dive.
You do.
Academic papers, we've got excerpts from religious texts, historical accounts, all kinds of stuff. Should be a wild ride.
Yeah.
So, to kick things off, let's just get the basics out of the way. What are we even talking about when we say sacrifice?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I mean, at its core, sacrifice involves offering something that's valuable. Often that involves some kind of destruction.
Yeah.
And it's usually to a higher power or for a specific purpose.
Right. But it's not always, something as dramatic as like a life being taken.
Or
right?
not at all.
Our sources go way beyond that.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about cattle in Namibia to food in Japan, and even the idea of self-sacrifice in early Christianity.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how these practices are all tied up in these social structures and cultural beliefs.
Right. It's all connected.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with the Herero people of Namibia.
Okay.
They're a fascinating case study because their whole world really revolves around cattle.
It does.
Like their social status, their relationships, even their beliefs about the afterlife, it's all about cattle.
It really is.
I was reading about their holy herd,
Right.
which is dedicated to their ancestors, and they even put cattle skulls on their ancestors' tombs as memorials. It's a pretty powerful image.
It is. It's a very visual representation of that connection,
Yeah.
to the ancestors.
And they even use a specific term, I'm probably going to mispronounce this,
Okay.
Ojambanga,
Ojambanga.
to refer to any sacrifices related to the dead.
Right.
And it's all about emphasizing that connection, keeping that line open between the living and those who've passed on.
Yeah. Maintaining that spiritual line.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I also thought it was really interesting that they offer the gallbladder of the sacrifice animal to the ancestors.
Yes.
Because the idea is that what's bitter for the living is actually considered sweet in the afterlife. It really makes you think about how differently, different cultures can view life and death.
Absolutely. And it kind of throws into question our assumptions about what's valuable, what's respectful, across cultures.
Right. But I guess it raises the question, if they revere cattle so much, how do they reconcile that with actually, sacrificing them?
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction. But I think, it speaks to the fact that it's not about taking life lightly, but it's about offering what they consider to be most precious.
Yeah.
To honor their ancestors, to keep that spiritual connection alive.
It's almost like an acknowledgement of that cycle of life and death.
Right.
And how it's all, kind of interconnected.
Yeah.
It makes you think about, our own ideas about what's sacred.
It does.
And how we express reverence.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on, from the Herero, our sources also explore how sacrifice is often really tied up with gender roles and power dynamics.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a thorny subject.
It is.
But the scholar Nancy J. makes a really interesting argument.
Yes.
That in societies where lineage is traced through the father, sacrifice can actually be a way for men to sort of establish these blood ties that go beyond the natural blood ties of childbirth.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to create a different kind of kinship.
Right.
That's separate from that natural bond between mother and child.
Exactly.
So she's suggesting that in some cultures, a man's role in a sacrifice is seen as more important than a woman actually giving birth.
That's kind of the gist of it, yeah.
Wow.
Like the act of childbirth itself is often viewed as, polluting, requiring some sort of purification. And that purification usually comes through an animal sacrifice.
Right.
And who typically dominates those rituals.
Yeah.
Men.
It's a way of asserting control, isn't it?
It is, yeah, over life and death.
Okay.
And even when the rituals are directed towards a female deity.
So even when they're making these offerings to a goddess, it's still the men who are in charge.
Exactly.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And Valeria's research on ancient Hawaii actually brings this home, this idea.
Okay.
In Hawaii, Sacrifice was all about connecting with the gods.
Right.
But men were the ones who controlled those rituals, even when they were sacrificing to goddesses.
So even in a society where they had these, powerful female deities, men still held on to that power when it came to sacrifice.
Absolutely.
And Valeri argues that this reflects a deeper value placed on political power over kinship ties.
Exactly. So the men's dominance in sacrifice reinforces their dominance in the political sphere.
It's not just a religious ritual.
Right.
It's a way of maintaining a social structure.
Right.
Are there other cultures where we see this same kind of dynamic at play?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Our sources talk about similar patterns in Turkey
Yeah.
and also amongst the island god people in the Philippines.
Okay.
So this idea that men use sacrifice to kind of solidify their power
Yeah.
seems to pop up again and again.
It's like this hidden language within these rituals.
It is.
That's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how many of those power dynamics are still, hidden in plain sight, kind of masquerading as these religious rituals.
Oh, that's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you question how much of, what we consider tradition is actually about maintaining power structures.
Right.
Okay, so unfortunately, our sources also delve into maybe the darkest side of all of this, the practice of sacrificing women.
Yeah.
Which is particularly prevalent in what they call honor and shame culture. So I have a feeling this is where things get pretty disturbing.
It is, yeah.
It's a tough subject, but it's something that, we have to talk about.
We do. And in these cultures, sacrificing women is seen as a way to purify the community, almost like a cleansing ritual.
Right.
And there's one example from ancient Greece, the Thesmophoria ritual, which is pretty chilling.
Okay.
They sacrifice pigs in this ritual, but the fact that a man had to actually perform the final act of sacrifice
Okay.
really suggests a very deep-seated fear of female power.
So they're sacrificing these animals, but it's almost like they're afraid to let a woman get too close to that act of taking a life.
It seems that way, yeah.
Oh, it's almost like everywhere you look, sacrifice is being used as a tool to control and oppress others.
Yeah.
Especially, it seems like, especially women.
Sadly, yeah, that's true.
Okay, well, let's maybe shift gears a little bit here.
Okay.
And look at a very different cultural context.
Sure.
We're going to go to Henza Village in Japan,
Yeah.
where everyday life is just steeped in ritual. And food plays a really central role.
It does.
And it's really interesting to see how these food rituals are divided along gender lines.
Yes.
Tell me more about these food rituals.
Okay, well, in Henza, women are in charge of these very elaborate food rituals.
Okay.
And our sources really emphasize that it's not just about the food itself.
Right.
It's about the meticulous preparation.
The presentation.
The presentation. Those acts, that's the ritual.
It's not just, what they're offering. It's the care and attention that goes into it.
Exactly. And it becomes a way of kind of elevating those everyday tasks into something sacred.
Right. So it's not just about those big ceremonies. It's about finding that sacredness in everyday life.
Right.
What about the men in Henza? What role do they play?
Yeah. Well, men's rituals are much more limited.
Okay.
And they tend to revolve around things like danger and blood and even death.
Okay.
A really striking example is the Tabor ritual, where an actual young man is sacrificed during times of communal danger.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Especially in contrast to what the women are doing.
Yeah.
It's such a stark difference.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that, the villagers themselves don't actually label these rituals as men's or women's.
Okay.
These are just categories that anthropologists have used.
Right, to try to make sense of these patterns.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a good reminder that, we're always kind of looking at things through our own lens.
Right.
But that contrast is it's really striking.
It is.
And it makes you wonder what these different approaches to sacrifice reveal about the underlying values and anxieties of a culture.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's travel back in time now.
Okay.
To ancient Mesopotamia.
Right.
Where temples weren't just places of worship,
No.
but they were also these bustling economic centers.
They were.
And sacrifice played a really important role in serving the gods and keeping everything in balance.
Absolutely.
So I'm picturing, these grand temples and priests in elaborate robes, and they're making offerings of what exactly?
Well, they would offer the gods shelter, food, drink, those essentials of life.
Okay.
But here's an interesting little detail.
Okay.
The food offered to the gods wasn't just left there. It was actually later distributed to the temple personnel and even to the king.
So the gods got the first taste, and then everyone else kind of benefited. It's
Right.
like this idea of shared abundance,
Yeah, I think so.
or maybe even this connection, between the divine and the earthly realm.
Absolutely.
Okay, now there's another aspect of Mesopotamian sacrifice that I think you'll find interesting.
Right.
They had this myth about human creation where humans were actually formed from clay that was mixed with the blood of a slaughtered god.
Yes,
Okay, that's pretty intense imagery.
it is.
What does a story like that tell us about, their worldview?
Well, it really connects to this idea of a personal god that was passed down through the male lineage.
Okay.
And they believed that the blood of that god was the source of human intelligence, our ability to plan and strategize.
So we inherit our very essence from a divine sacrifice.
Right. It's like a blueprint for humanity.
It's pretty powerful stuff.
It is.
Now, we should point out that some scholars actually think that this myth might have been influenced by Western Semitic cultures.
Right.
So it may not be representative of, all Mesopotamian beliefs.
Yeah. It's just important to keep that in mind.
It's a good reminder that these ancient cultures were all interconnected,
They were.
and ideas could, travel and evolve over time.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, speaking of complex ideas about sacrifice, let's turn our attention to ancient Judaism,
Okay.
where the role of sacrifice is really intricate,
It is.
and it raises some pretty challenging questions.
It does.
One of the biggest debates is whether firstborn sacrifice was ever an actual practice.
Yes.
Like, did it actually happen?
Right.
Or is it more symbolic?
Right.
Our sources present a variety of different interpretations.
Yeah.
Some scholars, like John Levinson,
Right.
believe it was a real practice
Yeah.
before the rise of the prophets in the 7th century BCE. Others, like Michael Fishbane, argue that the texts are actually referring to symbolic dedication, not a literal sacrifice.
Right.
So it's a tricky one.
It is. It's a sensitive topic
Yeah,
with no easy answers.
no easy answers. What about the priests in ancient Judaism? What role did they play in all of this?
Oh, they played a central role,
Yeah.
a very central role. And our sources actually go into the symbolism of their clothing,
Okay.
which is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like, rituals themselves.
Right.
Clothing can actually convey identity, power,
Okay.
and even bestow certain properties on the wearer.
So the priest's clothing wasn't just for show.
Yep.
It actually played a part in the ritual itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh.
And the garments of the Jewish high priest were especially elaborate,
Okay.
with all kinds of different elements. Bells, breastplates, robes, a special headpiece.
I'm imagining like a walking temple.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A symbol of both, earthly and divine authority. And rabbinic literature adds some interesting details.
Okay.
They say that God himself actually made these vestments for Adam.
Hmm.
And that when Aaron's garments were passed down to Eleazar, there was actually a miracle that happened
Okay.
to prevent nudity.
So these weren't just, pieces of fabric.
Yeah.
These were imbued with a special kind of power, it sounds like.
Right, transcending their material form.
Yeah, I guess that raises the question, how did all this symbolism, contribute to the meaning of the sacrifice itself?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to remember that in ancient Judaism, sacrifice wasn't just about appeasing God or asking for favors.
Right.
It was about maintaining this sacred covenant.
Okay.
This relationship with the divine.
Right.
That required both action
Right.
and inner transformation.
So the clothing was part of that process?
It was part of elevating that whole thing.
Okay.
The priest and the ritual itself to this higher spiritual plane.
Okay, so it was operating on multiple levels,
LS.
practical and symbolic.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's fast forward a few centuries now
Okay.
to the 4th century CE, and we're going to meet a really interesting guy, Julian the Apostate.
Oh,
He was a Roman emperor who actually tried to revive paganism
he did.
at a time when Christianity was, on the rise.
Yeah.
He was swimming against the tide, it seems like.
He really was.
What was his deal with sacrifice?
Well, he was deeply committed to it.
Okay.
Like really committed to the point where he was drenching altars with, the blood of countless animals. Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian, describes it as this scene of just excessive, bloodshed.
Yeah.
Almost like over the top.
I mean, given the sheer volume, it's hard to imagine that this was just about, appeasing the gods.
Right.
There must have been something more going on there.
Yeah, he believed that the sacrifices actually nourished the gods, and it was all part of connecting with the divine and maintaining this cosmic order.
Okay.
But here's the interesting part. He also tried to reform pagan practices
Yeah, okay.
to emphasize ethical conduct.
So it's almost like he was trying to create a more spiritualized version of paganism.
Yeah, maybe to counter, the growing influence of Christianity.
Right, almost like a PR campaign for the old gods.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension between, his philosophical ideals and the excesses of the actual practices.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if he was really trying to revive the essence of paganism,
Right.
or just kind of, clinging to a fading tradition.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, let's move on to another ancient tradition, Zoroastrianism.
Okay.
This religion has a complex and evolving relationship with animal sacrifice.
It does.
Not all Zoroastrian communities actually practice it today,
Right.
but animal representations are still a really important part of their rituals.
Yeah.
So even if the actual act of sacrifice has faded, that symbolism remains.
It persists.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so the ancient Greek geographer Strabo, he left us this fascinating account of animal sacrifice in ancient Zoroastrianism.
Right.
And they were really concerned with purity,
They were.
performing sacrifices near water without, contaminating it,
Right.
arranging the meat on myrtle or laurel branches.
Right.
It's interesting how deliberate they were about it all.
Yeah, very respectful.
Yeah, and there's this intriguing detail about how they actually killed animals in Cappadocia.
Okay.
They used a wooden club instead of a knife,
Interesting.
which is pretty different.
Yeah.
It suggests maybe a different understanding of the act of killing
Right.
compared to other cultures.
Yeah. It makes you think about the reasoning behind those choices.
Yeah, all those little details.
Right.
Okay, so they had specific requirements for the sacrificial animals themselves.
They did.
Had to be healthy,
Right.
strong, without any blemishes.
Right.
And they preferred to kill as few as possible.
Yeah. As few as possible, just enough to, feed the people.
So it wasn't about, needless slaughter.
Right.
It was about choosing, the best and offering it up with a sense of reverence.
Exactly.
And there were different interpretations of what animal sacrifice actually achieved in Zoroastrianism.
They were.
Some believed that it pleased the deities
Right.
and earned favors in return,
Right.
while others saw it as a way to nourish the spiritual doubles
Yes.
of both the living and the dead.
Right.
So again, those multi-layered meanings.
Exactly.
It's clear that, throughout history, sacrifice has been about so much more than just, appeasing gods or spirits.
It has.
It's about connecting to something larger than oneself, whether it's ancestors or the divine or even the cosmic order.
That's a great observation.
Okay, well, as we move into early Christianity,
Well,
we're going to see how this concept of sacrifice really transforms.
yeah.
The idea emerges that Jesus' death is a sacrifice that replaces, traditional animal offerings.
Right.
So this is where things get really interesting, especially, for anyone familiar with Christian theology.
Absolutely. And early Christians, they had to grapple with, how Jesus' death, which was an act of violence, how that could be seen as a sacrifice.
Right.
That atones for sins.
Right.
And offers forgiveness.
It's a pretty radical departure from, from those old ideas of offering animals on an altar.
It is.
What were some of the, the key questions that they struggled with?
Well, they had to figure out how Jesus's death as a single act could have such a profound impact on humanity.
Right.
How could this one event change everything? And our sources highlight how the very concept of forgiveness itself evolved over time.
Okay.
It shifted from a focus on outward social transgressions
Okay.
to a more kind of introspective understanding of guilt.
Right. So it's not just about righting a wrong in the eyes of the community.
Right.
It's about a fundamental shift in your relationship with God.
Right. And with yourself.
And yourself.
Yeah.
And there's this really interesting connection they made between early Christian thought
Yeah.
and the Levitical Jubilee described in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
This idea of a time of release from debts and restoration.
Right. A fresh start.
So they saw Jesus' sacrifice as a kind of jubilee for all humanity.
Exactly. Yeah. A chance for a new beginning.
That's a pretty powerful metaphor.
It is.
But of course, even within Christianity, there were debates about what this sacrifice actually meant.
There were.
What were some of the sticking points?
Well, our sources discuss the Eucharist, which
Mhm.
is such a central ritual in Christianity.
All right.
And they talk about how its meaning was really debated.
Okay.
Some saw it as a substitute for the original sacrifice,
Okay.
a symbolic act.
Right.
Others saw it as more of a metaphor for spiritual nourishment.
Okay.
And still, others saw it as a sacrament that actually reenacts Christ's sacrifice.
So even within a single religion, the concept of sacrifice is really fluid
It is.
and open to interpretation.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's all about, the nuances and the different perspectives.
It is. It's about appreciating the diversity
Mhm.
of, the human religious experience.
Okay, well, speaking of which, our sources also take us on a deep dive into the concept of the scapegoat,
Yeah.
particularly in the context of Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement.
Right.
So for those who maybe aren't familiar, the scapegoat ritual involved, transferring the sins of the people onto a goat,
Right.
and then that goat was sent out into the wilderness.
Yeah,
It's a pretty powerful image
it is.
of purification and restoring balance and harmony.
Absolutely.
I imagine the early Christians had quite a bit to say about this ritual,
They did.
especially, given their belief in Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice.
Right.
How did they interpret, this ancient practice?
Well,
Yeah.
our sources explore a few different ways that early Christians kind of tried to fit this ancient ritual into their own understanding of sin and sacrifice and redemption.
Yeah, some saw it as like a foreshadowing of Jesus,
Okay.
as the one who takes away the sins of the world.
Right.
Others saw it more as like a symbol of the expulsion of evil,
Okay.
or as a means of achieving atonement. So they're kind of trying to reconcile this older idea with their new belief system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to another important symbol
Yeah.
that's central to both Judaism and Christianity.
Right.
The temple.
The temple.
The temple in Jerusalem, a place of worship, sacrifice, and ultimately destruction.
Yes.
So the temple held this immense significance for both religions.
It did.
But its meaning was interpreted in different ways.
It was.
Some saw it as the literal dwelling place of God.
Right.
Others saw it as more of a microcosm of the universe, and
Yeah.
still others saw it as a representation of the human body itself.
Right.
So it wasn't just a building.
No, it was.
It represented something much, much bigger.
Absolutely.
And when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, its meaning had to be, reinterpreted.
It did, especially by early Christians.
Right.
Who, no longer had that physical space.
Yeah, that must have been a real turning point for them.
It was.
How did they make sense of their faith without this physical center?
Well, that's where this idea of the individual believer's body as a temple emerged.
Okay, so it becomes internalized.
Yeah, the destruction of that physical temple, it becomes a catalyst for this inward turn,
Okay.
this focus on, spiritual transformation.
Right, so it's not about the external ritual anymore. It's
Yeah.
about what's happening inside.
Exactly. And this idea that God's presence can reside within each person.
It's a pretty powerful shift in perspective.
It is.
Okay, so now our deep dive takes us to Islam, another major world religion that really kind of reframed the concept of sacrifice
Right.
and challenged a lot of those those traditional notions about ritual and offering.
Yes, because Islam emerges centuries after Christianity,
Right.
and they had to figure out how to incorporate this idea of sacrifice
Hmm.
while also staying true to this very strict commitment to monotheism.
Right, avoiding anything that could be seen as idolatry.
Exactly. Yeah.
So did they just forbid animal sacrifice completely?
Not entirely,
Okay.
but their approach is very different.
Okay.
In Islam, shirk, which is associating anything with God,
Okay.
is a major sin.
Okay.
And that ties directly into their rejection of idolatry.
So no statues, no offerings to a pantheon of gods.
Right.
But how does that work with animal sacrifice, which in other religions is, often directed at specific deities?
Right. So that's where the Islamic great sacrifice comes in.
Okay.
Or Eid al-Adha.
Eid al-Adha.
Right. And this annual event, it kind of reframed traditional animal sacrifice, turning it into a symbol of submission to the one God.
So instead of appeasing a god or seeking favors,
Right.
it's about demonstrating obedience and devotion.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. The act of sacrificing an animal becomes this acknowledgement of, God's power
Right.
over life and death.
Okay.
And it's a really powerful reminder that the meaning of sacrifice can change so much
Yeah.
depending on the religious context.
Right. So these ancient practices,
Yeah,
they're incredibly adaptable.
they are.
And they can be, reinterpreted
Yeah.
to fit new belief systems.
Exactly.
And our sources point out this interesting parallel between the Islamic great sacrifice
Yes.
and certain passages in the Old Testament that
Yeah.
emphasize, inner transformation over external rituals.
Exactly.
So it's not just about the outward actions anymore. It's about the state of the heart,
Right.
the intention behind it.
It's about aligning your will with God's will.
Right. So there's this idea that true sacrifice
Yeah.
lies in surrendering to something larger than yourself.
Exactly, to a higher purpose. And that's an idea that, resonates across a lot of different spiritual traditions, even those that, that don't involve ritual sacrifice.
Right.
It's about, giving up your ego,
Right.
your desires
Right.
for something bigger.
Yeah. It's a powerful concept.
It is. And as we've gone through all these different examples of sacrifice,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, are there some common threads here? What can we learn about this, this seemingly universal human practice?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, after all this, what are the takeaways?
Yeah, what are the big ideas?
Well, one thing that strikes me is that sacrifice, even when it seems violent or disturbing,
Right.
it's rarely about death itself.
Okay.
It's about transformation.
Okay.
It's about giving up something precious to achieve a desired outcome, whether that's pleasing a deity or strengthening social bonds or purifying a community or even, achieving spiritual enlightenment.
So it's about using loss or the willingness to embrace loss
Right.
as a catalyst for something new and better.
Exactly.
And that something better can take so many different forms.
It can.
Yeah, from material blessings to spiritual to purification,
Right.
to a deeper connection with the divine.
Absolutely.
It makes me think about how we use the word sacrifice in everyday language.
Yeah.
We talk about sacrificing our time, our energy, our comfort
Right.
to achieve our goals or to help others or to live a life that's aligned with our values.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Those ancient rituals we've been talking about may seem really distant, but those underlying human impulses,
Yeah.
they're still there.
Yeah, that need to make sacrifices, to offer something of ourselves
Right.
for something we deem worthy.
Right.
It seems to be a pretty fundamental part of being human.
It really does, and it expresses itself in so many ways.
Yeah.
From those grand ceremonies to just those everyday acts of selflessness
Right.
that connect us to each other.
It really makes me wonder, what does sacrifice mean in the lives of our listeners?
That's a great question.
Are there modern day equivalents to these ancient practices?
Yeah, where do you draw that line between a healthy sacrifice and something that's harmful
Hmm.
or self-destructive even?
Yeah. These are really important questions to reflect on.
They are. And I think understanding how we each approach sacrifice in our own lives
Yeah.
can really offer some insights into our values, our motivations,
Yeah,
what we're really longing for.
absolutely.
So it's been quite a journey so far,
It has.
exploring this world of sacrifice across different cultures and through time.
We've encountered everything from cattle skulls and gallbladders to food rituals and scapegoats,
Right.
from elaborate vestments to the concept of the human body as a temple. And we've seen how this concept that's so often associated with, with violence and bloodshed
Right.
can also be a powerful expression of devotion and community and this search for meaning
It can.
in a world that's full of uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to leave you with this idea that one of our sources explores. And I found this particularly interesting.
Okay.
It's this idea of sacrifice through a lens that they call negative sacrificology.
Negative sacrificology. Okay, I'm not sure I've heard that term before.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful concept. It
Right.
kind of challenges that traditional understanding of sacrifice
Okay.
by looking at those situations where the sacrifice isn't asked for by a higher power
Okay.
and it's not offered willingly, but it still has this profound impact.
So it's about sacrifices that are forced upon someone,
Right.
maybe even unjustly,
Right.
but still have a deeper meaning.
Exactly. And the source uses this example of Soma Morgenstern's novel, The Third Pillar, which explores the Holocaust through this lens of negative sacrificology.
That's a heavy topic.
It is.
But I can see how the concept of sacrifice kind of resonates in the context of such unimaginable suffering.
Right. The novel suggests that the deaths of innocent children during the Holocaust can be seen as a kind of sacrifice.
Right. Yeah.
Not in a traditional sense, obviously,
Right.
but as this consequence of human cruelty and indifference.
So it's a sacrifice imposed by human actions,
Right.
not by divine will.
Exactly.
It raises all sorts of challenging questions
It does?
about the nature of suffering and how we make sense of loss in a world where these kinds of things are possible.
Right. It forces us to confront, those darkest aspects of human nature
Yeah.
and to ask ourselves, how do we find meaning in such senseless loss?
It's a reminder that sacrifice isn't always about choice. Sometimes it's about enduring the consequences of things that are totally beyond our control.
Yeah.
And yet, even in those situations, it seems like the human spirit can find ways to imbue those sacrifices with meaning.
Yeah. You've hit on something really important there. I think even when we're faced with the worst that that humanity can offer, we can still find ways to transform that loss
Right.
into something else.
Yeah.
Into resilience, into resistance, even into hope.
Right.
It's a real testament to the human spirit, I think.
Absolutely. So we've been talking about this idea of negative sacrificology, where the sacrifice is it's imposed, it's not something you choose, and yet it still carries a lot of weight. It makes me think about those innocent lives lost during the Holocaust, for instance. The sacrifices weren't made by choice, but they still resonate with us today.
It's a really difficult concept to grapple with, but it forces us to confront some very real and very uncomfortable questions about the nature of suffering and how we make meaning out of these senseless acts.
Right. It's a reminder that sacrifice isn't always, a grand gesture or something that we choose willingly. Sometimes it's about enduring the consequences of things that are completely outside of our control.
Exactly.
But you mentioned this other really fascinating idea before the break, that true sacrifice actually requires us to confront what you called our own inner beast. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's this idea that we all have these primal instincts within us: fear, anger, greed, lust for power, all those things that can lead us to harm ourselves or to harm others.
So it's about acknowledging those darker parts of our nature,
Right.
and facing them head on.
Yes, and the source we're looking at suggests that true sacrifice isn't just about outward actions, but it's about this this willingness to look inward, to
Mhm.
to wrestle with those impulses, and to ultimately, choose a different path.
So it's like an internal struggle, a constant battle between our base instincts and our higher aspirations.
That's a good way to put it. It's a struggle that demands courage and honesty,
Yeah.
and a willingness to let go of those things that are holding us back from becoming our best selves.
It makes me think that maybe the most profound sacrifices that we make aren't necessarily these grand gestures or these public displays, but those quiet internal victories. Where we choose compassion over anger, generosity over greed, forgiveness over resentment.
Beautifully said. Yeah, it's that inner work of self-examination that really shapes who we are.
It all circles back to that question that you raised earlier. If true sacrifice is about this inner struggle, what's the role of all those external symbols that we've been talking about? The cattle, the food, the scapegoats. Where do they fit in?
That's a really fascinating question, and the source we're looking at suggests that those symbols actually act as a kind of mirror,
Yeah.
reflecting back to us those parts of ourselves that we may be afraid to face directly.
So the sacrificial animal, the meticulously prepared food, the scapegoat sent out into the wilderness, they all represent something within us that we're trying to purify, to release, to change.
Exactly, they become these tangible representations of our inner demons, our anxieties, our need to make amends.
It's a really powerful way to think about how ritual and symbolism can help us, to navigate the complexities of being human.
And it highlights how powerful these ancient practices really are. Even in a world that's becoming more and more secular, these ideas still resonate with us.
It makes you wonder if this need to sacrifice, to offer something of ourselves for something greater, is somehow hardwired into us.
It's a very compelling thought, and as we've seen throughout this deep dive, sacrifice is it's a concept that continues to adapt, to
Yeah.
find new ways of expressing itself, even as the rituals themselves fade or disappear.
It's a testament to that incredible duality within us, our capacity for both darkness and light, for destruction and creation. And I think it speaks to our ongoing search for meaning, for connection, for something beyond our individual lives.
You've said it beautifully. It really has been an incredible journey exploring this complex world of sacrifice, and I'm left with this sense of awe at the sheer diversity and complexity of the human religious experience.
We've gone from cattle skulls on Namibian tombs to the blood of a slaughtered god in Mesopotamian mythology, from the scapegoat ritual of Yom Kippur to the idea of the human body as a temple. It's been quite a ride.
We've seen so many different beliefs and practices and interpretations, and it really challenges us to broaden our understanding of sacrifice and its lasting significance.
Well, this deep dive has been both enlightening and humbling, and I think it reminds us that the human search for meaning, for connection, for something that transcends our individual lives, it takes so many different forms.
And I hope it has left you, the listener, with a deeper appreciation for the power of ritual, the symbolism embedded within these acts of sacrifice, and that enduring human need to offer something of ourselves for something greater, whether it's to appease a deity or to strengthen those bonds that connect us as humans, or to purify our communities, or simply to become better versions of ourselves.
Well, thank you for joining us on this incredible exploration of sacrifice. Until next time, keep diving deep.